have to tell you, I woke up from a funny dream this morning, about 6, light just coming in the window. And in my dream, I dreamt that I had slept all the way through Sunday morning. I woke up at 1 in the afternoon. Now, this is a dream, which means it wasn't censored, right? This is just like how I felt. And the fascinating thing was what my reaction to that fact when I saw the alarm clock. It was a little embarrassing, I mean, really. But I wasn't like worried about it. I wasn't, oh my God, what did they do? They didn't have a preacher, oh dear. I thought, oh, they would have been fine. I wonder what they decided to do. I bet it was fun. Somebody would have thought of something and there would have been some cool music and they had a good time without me. The point is, even in my dream, we are just fine. Isn't that good? Yes, I thought that was good. Okay. Oh, I love it. So today we are going to talk about the historical Jesus. Discovering that such a study, this scholarly study of who Jesus actually was as a person, discovering that some 25 years ago was huge for me. It let me make sense of Christianity and come back to the church again after a 20-year absence. And now with new people in our circle who are making for themselves that same discovery, I get to relive it. It's just great. So the Wednesday discussion group, starting after Easter, is going to be reading the same book that a number of us read 20 years ago, Marcus Borg's Meeting Jesus Again for the First Time. This is a wonderful introduction to the historical Jesus because Borg was such a good writer. He was a professor up at Oregon State for years, and he writes so carefully. If there's any doubt about what he means by his words, he will just say, when I use the word da-da, what I mean is da-da. Do you know how many people there are who write in the field of religion and spirituality and are not that clear with their language? It's a treasure. He's just a treasure. Let me give you an example. This is his summary list, the list that he uses to organize the book of who the historical Jesus was. I actually keep this list kind of somewhere in the back of my head, I have for a long time, just because it helps me understand a way to talk about all the different facets. So first off, the historical Jesus was a spirit person, one of those figures in human history with an experiential awareness of the reality of God. Secondly, Jesus was a teacher of wisdom who regularly used the classic forms of wisdom speech, parables, and memorable short sayings known as aphorisms, to teach a subversive and alternative wisdom, otherwise known as love is the most powerful force in the universe. 3, Jesus was a social prophet, similar to the classical prophets of ancient Israel. As such, he criticized the elites, economic, political, and religious, of his time, was an advocate of an alternative social vision, and was often in conflict with the authorities. And 4, Jesus was a movement founder who brought into being a Jewish renewal or revitalization movement that challenged and shattered the social boundaries of his day, a movement that eventually became the early Christian church. That's a terrific summary, and that the rest of the book is his expounding on those 4 points. So everybody's invited to join the Wednesday group. We're starting on April 10th with a book discussion of this, and I just love going back to this stuff. The other theologian and historian whose work has been important to me is John Dominic Crossan, who is still alive at age 90. They just celebrated his 90th birthday. He and Borg were great friends. They wrote books together. They and their wives traveled all over Europe and the Middle East, going to archaeological sites and museums and learning. They were influential members of the Jesus Seminar at the very beginning, and so on. So I've been taking this online course with Crossan on the historical Jesus, and naturally I've learned some things that I thought would be good to share with you. And the course focused on what's called the last week, meaning the time in Jesus' life between Palm Sunday and Easter. What makes Crossan so interesting to engage with in these kinds of studies is that he knows the surrounding context so well. It isn't just that he's focused on the Bible and he knows the Jesus story. He knows the context of it, he's read all the Latin and Greek classics in all their original languages, naturally, and he's a student of Judaism, of all the different forms of Christianity. He's probably memorized the historians like Josephus and Philo of Alexandria, who wrote about the time when Jesus was alive. So we have what the Bible tells us about Jesus, and then Josephus is like this second, it's like having binary vision, a second comment on what's happening from a historian's perspective. So the first question is, how did the story of the last week of Jesus' life come to be written down? It didn't happen right away, right? There was an oral tradition as people shared what they remembered and what they've heard from other people. And depending on the community you were in, you told the story a little bit differently. The first of the Gospels to be written down was Mark in the late 60s, which is already, 35 years after Jesus died. A lot can happen to a story in 35 years. But that's why I had asked Marguerite to read that whole thing. That's our earliest written account of that last week. We don't really know the identity of the author of Mark, but he almost surely was not an eyewitness to the crucifixion. So he's writing what he has heard. And here's the interesting thing. Some of what he wrote came from the oral tradition, which is what Crossan calls history remembered. You're writing down the things that have been passed on from people who were actually there. But for other detail, Mark goes back to a source that he knew very well, which is the Torah. And he describes Jesus' suffering in the terms that the prophets described Israel's suffering, which is why we get all these parallels between Psalm 22, that if you were at Taizé a week ago or so, I read sections of, and this section of Mark. So the psalm begins with the line, my God, why have you forsaken me? And Mark has Jesus saying that on the cross. Did he actually say it? I don't know. Or is Mark trying to tell you this is how Israel expresses itself when it is suffering? Therefore, Jesus he's like the culmination of Israel's suffering. In verse 18 of the Psalm, which of course was written 1,000 years before Jesus came along, verse 18 says, they divide my clothes among themselves, and for my clothing they cast lots. So here we are at the crucifixion, and he's got the soldiers and divided his clothes among them, casting lots to decide what each should take. Did they actually do that? Or is Mark just bringing prophecy forward in time? Crossan calls that prophecy historicized. So we don't actually know what happened at the crucifixion. But this is what we've got to go on. Here's the other problem. Matthew and Luke use Mark's story. Yeah, well, it was common practice in those days. We don't call it plagiarism then. It was just, this is the story we've got, and they add some detail to it. There's extra stuff in Matthew and Luke, but they start with Mark. So Matthew and Luke don't really give us an independent crucifixion story. And the jury's still out on whether the account in John is independent or not, and Crossan thinks it isn't, which if that's the case, we really only have one story, which is the one you heard from Marguerite. So for better or worse, that's what we've got. And how much of it is imagined detail based on knowing what the prophet said, we may never be able to tease out. It's just interesting. Then we spent a while in the course looking at the story of Barabbas, the robber who was freed by Pilate. So I'm glad we did that, because it has always puzzled me that the crowd called for Jesus to be crucified. I mean, the crowd was waving palms and shouting Hosanna just a few days before, and now they're, like, what made them flip? What happened? Well, duh, Polly, it's not the same people. I don't know why it took me so long to figure that out, right? The palm wavers on Palm Sunday are the Jesus supporters. They're the poor, the oppressed. They're the ones to whom he came and offered this alternative vision. The people in Pilate's court who are yelling for crucifixion, first of all, we really don't know how many there are. Crowd is a very amorphous term. But the people who hung around Pilate's court were not the poor and oppressed. They were the supporters of Rome, the people who even knew you could go into Pilate's court without, getting clobbered. And most likely, there were among them some folks who had been persuaded by the high priests and the temple elite to support crucifixion. In fact, one of the Gospels, I can't remember which one, even said that the high priest persuaded people to shout for crucifixion. So it's not the same crowd at all. Who actually wanted Jesus crucified? It's actually rather important to pay attention to this. It was primarily the high priests in the temple, Caiaphas, Jonathan, Simon, the elite from the temple hierarchy who were threatened by him, who wouldn't be, right? But they were also collaborators with Rome. It was a standard occupation story, just like happened in the world wars. In any time one army occupies another country, there are local people who find it expedient to collaborate with the enemy. We have not nice words for people like that: turncoats, quislings, traitors, because of course they're betraying their own people. So they weren't popular. The high priests were not popular with the general population of Jews in Jerusalem. And we'll look in a minute why it's important to be very careful when you talk about who actually was responsible. Crossan wonders if the Barabbas story was actually a literary invention of Mark. It was the first time I'd heard that idea thrown out. And the reason he asks that is that he can find in all this surrounding literature with which he is very familiar, no independent attestation of a custom of complete amnesty at Passover. Nobody else ever talks about it. And Josephus in particular spends quite a while in a very detailed description of Pilate, He comes across as an efficient, if somewhat brutal, administrator. There is a report that he once allowed a crucifixion to be delayed because it was scheduled to happen on the emperor's birthday. And he thought, oh no, you can go celebrate the birthday with your family. You can die the day after, it's okay. That's like as merciful as he got. But complete amnesty for somebody? And Crossan is just figuring, if that really were a custom, you'd think somebody like Josephus would have mentioned it. I mean, he's got all these other details going on. And then there's the odd name of the robber, right? Barabbas. Bar is Hebrew for son. Bar, Abbas. Abba is father. Son of the father. Well, duh. I mean, what does that mean? I don't know. Doesn't prove anything. He's just pointing out that it's a very curious name. And then there's the question of, if it is a literary invention, why would Mark do that? And Crossan just posits that it makes the choice very clear between Barabbas, who lives by the knife, remember, rule by violence, rule by force, and Jesus, the nonviolent resistor, ruled by persuasion, ruled by love. Perhaps he wanted to make the choice extremely clear. We don't really know, but it's interesting. He just points out that nobody else ever talks about that custom. The failure to understand and accurately portray who was really responsible for Jesus' death has caused an incalculable amount of damage over the years. Because Mark is careful to say the high priest, but if you look through the rest of the gospel accounts, and especially when you get to John, Pilate goes out to the Jews to ask, who do you want released? So it's not surprising that people took away from the story the way it's portrayed in John with this idea that the Jews killed Jesus. That's what it says. The Jews asked for him to be crucified. It's fueled anti-Semitism for 2 millennia. And here's an example of, I just find this fact fascinating. I have no idea how to connect the dots. I just think it's something happened there. Have any of you ever been to Oberammergau and seen the Passion Play? Okay, so this is a little village in Bavaria, right? And in 1634, the bubonic plague was sweeping through that area. Half the village died, and the other half made a promise to God. You gotta be careful when you make those kind of promises. That they would put on a passion play every 10 years indefinitely if God would spare the other half of the village. Well, apparently nobody else died, and God called their bluff. And they've been putting on this passion play every 10 years since 1634. Play lasts for 5 hours. I mean, it's a big event. It covers a number of Bible scenes besides just the last week of Jesus' life. Older versions, not the version you see today, but older versions of that script were apparently fairly anti-Semitic. And you can see in these Bible verses how they could get to that place if they're using John instead of Matthew as their source. But in 1934, that older version was the one that Hitler saw. He sat through 5 hours of that play and came away from the play saying, with the conclusion that Jewry was a menace. Now, surely he was already on that track and it just added fuel to the fire, but you never know, if you're not careful with your history, what the impact's going to be. Crossan just points out that we have to face the fact that the New Testament is anti-Semitic and deal with it before we can eradicate the consequences of telling that story for 2,000 years. As you gathered from that little section of board that I read at the beginning, Jesus was an activist. And rather like Reverend Dr. Martin Luther King Jr., who was Jesus' disciple in more ways than one, Jesus believed in nonviolent resistance. He didn't originate the idea, but he most certainly practiced it. And just like King, you conclude that it's the only practical approach for an oppressed minority up against a much stronger, better armed occupying force. It's crazy to try to match force with force because you've lost at the beginning. So, just like any modern nonviolent activist, Jesus engaged in demonstrations, in political theater to make his point. For example, did you ever wonder why on Palm Sunday Jesus needs a donkey to ride into Jerusalem? I mean, is he tired? I don't know. He walks in from Bethany every day, just about. But no, on this day, he wanted to ride in, and he specifically wanted to ride a donkey. Now, it's because he wanted to set up a contrast with the other parade that was happening at the far side of the city. See, Jesus is coming up from Bethany from the south. In from the inland and the kind of the northeast comes Pilate, who lives in Caesarea Philippi on the coast. But at Passover, he came into Jerusalem every year because so many people were there. Something always happens when you jam the city full of people. He's the governor. He's got to be there on site, take care of it. So, but what does Pilate's parade look like? Oh, he's on a war horse, he's got armed soldiers, he's got, Roman supporters. No. Look, Jesus wanted to say, look how different my parade is. I'm on a donkey. I got people waving palm branches, no weapons in sight. It's the contrast he's after. Another classic nonviolent resistance move is economic disruption, which is what turning over the tables in the temple was all about. Nobody got hurt in that little exercise, but the economics of selling the animals to sacrifice in the temple to feed the priest, the whole bit, got, at least for a little while, the animals were loose and the coins were scattered all over the ground. And rather like, when MLK organized the bus boycott in Montgomery after Rosa Parks was arrested, it's like, if this is how you're going to treat us on the bus, we just won't ride the public buses. And they didn't. And after a while, it made a difference. Economic disruption, classic strategy. Crossan began every lecture with a slide showing side-by-side images of Caesar and Jesus, a statue of Caesar and an icon of Jesus. He repeatedly contrasted the ways in which they achieve peace, and we've talked about this before. Caesar is peace through war and victory, so peace through violent means, and Jesus is peace through distributive justice, nonviolent means. Interestingly enough, Caesar and Jesus did have titles in common. They were both called by their followers Lord, God, Redeemer, Savior of the world, Son of God. And that's because Caesar got there first, by the way, with those titles. 2,000 years ago, that's how you expressed the fact that this individual was exalted. Caesar was exalted in the realm of victory by force. And when Jesus came along and was exalted in the realm of justice and peace through persuasion, they gave him the titles that said to that culture, this is an exalted person. I just find that so interesting. In the literature, as Crossan has read it all, he has, all those titles are there for both men. And the course ended with what Crossan calls the evolutionary challenge. How do we stop the violence, which now imperils us as a species? We have not evolved very far, if at all, from the time of Jesus. Anyway, I have one more class. If I learn something extra, I'll tell you next week.